The year was 1221. In the city of Nishapur, a Mongol general named Tokuchar lay dying, an arrow protruding from his neck. As his blood seeped into the Persian soil, he whispered final words to his wife Genghis Khan's daughter. What happened next would become one of history's most methodical acts of vengeance. When the Khan's daughter received news of her husband's death, she did not weep. Instead, she made a request that would chill the blood of even hardened warriors. She asked her father for the honor of deciding Nishapur's fate. Genghis Khan, bound by Mongol tradition and paternal devotion, granted her wish. The princess's decree was simple. Every living soul in Nishapur would die. Not just the soldiers who had fired the fatal arrow, not just the city's leaders, everyone. Men, women, children, even the cats and dogs that wandered the streets. The city's population of over 1 million would be reduced to 0, but death alone was not enough for the grieving daughter. She ordered that the heads of every victim be stacked in separate pyramids, one for men, one for women, one for children. The towers of skulls rose so high they could be seen from miles away, a monument to Mongol fury that travelers would describe for generations. Even the Persian chronicler Juvayni, writing decades later, struggled to find words for what he called a deed so terrible that it seemed the world had never seen its like. This was not madness. This was not the random cruelty of a barbarian warlord. This was the calculated application of a system of terror so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating, that it would reshape the very concept of warfare and conquest. What the world witnessed at Nishapur was not an aberration, it was Mongol policy. Behind the legend of Genghis Khan as a unifier and empire builder lies a documented reality so brutal that medieval chroniclers, already accustomed to violence, wrote of Mongol practices with trembling hands. The man born as Temujin had not merely conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history through superior tactics and horseback mobility. He had weaponized terror itself, transforming psychological warfare into an art form that would make modern torture techniques seem primitive by comparison. The Mongols had created what can only be described as an industrialized system of human suffering. According to the secret history of the Mongols and contemporary Persian, Chinese, and European chronicles, Genghis Khan's empire was built upon practices so systematically cruel that they defied the moral frameworks of every civilization they encountered. The Mongols had not simply adapted to warfare, they had reinvented it by understanding that the human mind could be broken more effectively than any fortress wall. What emerges from historical documents is not the romanticized image of noble horse warriors, but evidence of a military culture that had perfected methods of psychological domination through calculated atrocity. These were not spontaneous acts of battlefield rage, but carefully planned operations designed to create such terror that entire kingdoms would surrender without resistance. The most disturbing aspect was not the scale of Mongol violence, but its precision. Every act of cruelty served a strategic purpose. Every massacre was a message, every torture was a demonstration. Genghis Khan had discovered that the fear of what Mongols might do was often more powerful than what they actually did. This system would prove so effective that within decades, the mere rumor of approaching Mongol armies would cause cities to empty and kingdoms to collapse. The Mongols had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made terror itself into their most powerful weapon. The Mongol approach to psychological warfare began with a practice that medieval chroniclers struggled to comprehend: the systematic use of human shields composed of captured civilians. When approaching a fortified city, Mongol engineers would force thousands of captives, men, women, and children, to fill moats, carry siege equipment, and absorb the initial volleys of arrows from defenders. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, the Mongols had perfected a technique they called driving the flock. Captured populations from previously conquered territories would be herded before the Mongol army like cattle. These human shields served multiple purposes. They absorbed enemy fire, filled defensive ditches with their bodies, and forced defenders to kill their own people or watch helplessly as their kinsmen died. The psychological impact was devastating. City defenders found themselves in an impossible position: fire upon the advancing army and kill their own families, or hold their fire and allow the Mongols to approach unimpeded. Many fortifications fell, not through superior siegecraft, but because defenders could not bring themselves to shoot through crowds of their own people. But the Mongols had refined this practice beyond mere tactical advantage. They understood that forcing a population to participate in their own destruction created a form of psychological paralysis that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Survivors would carry the trauma of these experiences, spreading fear to unconquered territories with a credibility that no Mongol propaganda could match. The Chinese chronicler Zhao Hong documented how Mongol generals would deliberately select captives based on their potential psychological impact. Priests, scholars, and civic leaders were kept alive specifically to witness atrocities, then released to spread accounts of Mongol brutality. These weren't random survivors, they were carefully chosen psychological weapons, walking testimonies to Mongol power. Contemporary accounts describe how Mongol armies would arrange these human shields in formations designed for maximum visual impact. Families were kept together so that parents would watch their children die, spouses would see their partners fall, and entire communities would be destroyed before the eyes of neighboring settlements. The Mongols had discovered that witnessing suffering was often more psychologically damaging than experiencing it directly. The efficiency was staggering. European chroniclers noted that Mongol armies could process thousands of captives in hours, sorting them by utility, age, and psychological value with the mechanical precision of a military logistics operation. This wasn't chaotic slaughter, it was organized terror applied with industrial efficiency. Genghis Khan's empire had developed what can only be described as a taxonomy of torture, with different methods reserved for different social classes and strategic objectives. The Yuanshi chronicles and Persian sources reveal that Mongol commanders carried detailed protocols for breaking the will of specific populations. For captured nobility, the Mongols employed a technique called the silver death. Molten silver would be poured into the victim's eyes and ears, a method that served both as execution and symbolic mockery of aristocratic wealth. The process was deliberately slow, designed to be witnessed by other captives who would carry the memory to unconquered territories. Artisans and skilled craftsmen faced a different fate entirely. They were kept alive, but subjected to what Persian chroniclers called the breaking of hands. Master blacksmiths would have their thumbs crushed with specialized tools, musicians would have their fingers systematically broken, and scribes would be blinded in one eye. These craftsmen were then forced to continue working at reduced capacity, their mutilated state serving as a permanent reminder of Mongol power. The Mongols had identified that destroying a culture's creative capacity was more demoralizing than simple massacre. A population could recover from death, but a civilization could not easily restore knowledge and skill that had taken generations to develop. By targeting cultural creators specifically, the Mongols attacked the very foundation of societal identity. Religious figures faced the most psychologically sophisticated torments. According to Islamic chronicler Ibn al-Athir, Mongol commanders would force captured priests to perform parodies of their own religious ceremonies. Christian clergy would be made to conduct mock masses using human blood instead of wine. Islamic clerics would be forced to recite prayers while standing on copies of the Quran. Buddhist monks would be compelled to eat meat while chanting sacred vegetarian vows. These weren't spontaneous acts of sacrilege, but carefully planned psychological operations designed to shatter the spiritual foundation of conquered peoples. The Mongols understood that destroying religious authority was more effective than destroying religious buildings. Structures could be rebuilt, but faith, once perverted and degraded, was far more difficult to restore. Contemporary sources describe how Mongol psychological specialists, for lack of a better term, would study captured populations to identify their deepest cultural taboos. They would then design specific tortures that violated these sacred boundaries, creating trauma that extended far beyond physical pain into the realm of spiritual and cultural destruction. The precision was chilling. Mongol records, preserved in Chinese archives, detail how different torture methods were catalogued by effectiveness against specific population types. What worked to break Persian merchants differed from techniques effective against Russian peasants or Chinese scholars. The Mongols had created an empirical science of human suffering. The most disturbing aspect of Mongol conquest was not what happened during battles, but what occurred in the systematic processing centers that followed in their wake. Historical accounts describe vast camps where captured populations were sorted, catalogued, and prepared for their assigned fates with the efficiency of a military supply operation. According to Armenian chronicler Kyriakos Ganzaketsi, these camps operated according to strict protocols that revealed the industrial nature of Mongol cruelty. Children under 10 were separated immediately, not for mercy, but because the Mongols had discovered that young minds could be completely reprogrammed to serve their captors. These children would be raised as Mongols, their original identities systematically erased until they became enforcers of the very system that had destroyed their families. Women of childbearing age faced a fate that Persian sources describe with barely concealed horror. They were subjected to what can only be called reproductive slavery, forced to bear children for the Mongol war machine. But this wasn't random sexual violence. It was a calculated breeding program designed to create a generation of mixed-blood children who would serve as cultural bridges for Mongol administration. The psychological sophistication was staggering. Mongol commanders understood that children born of rape would be rejected by their mother's original communities, but would never be fully accepted by their father's people. These children would grow up belonging to neither culture, making them ideal instruments for Mongol control. They had no loyalty except to the system that gave them identity. Elderly populations faced systematic humiliation designed to destroy the authority structures of conquered societies. According to the chronicler Juzjani, respected elders would be forced to perform degrading acts in front of their communities, crawling like animals, eating refuse, or engaging in behaviors that violated every cultural norm they had spent lifetimes upholding. The Mongols had discovered that destroying the dignity of authority figures was more effective than simply killing them. A dead elder could become a martyr, but a humiliated one destroyed the very concept of wisdom and respect within their culture. Survivors would carry not just grief, but a fundamental questioning of all social hierarchies. Men of military age, who were spared death, faced incorporation into Mongol armies as expendable frontline troops. But this wasn't simple conscription, it was psychological warfare against their own people. These forced recruits would be sent to attack their former neighbors, creating situations where survival required betraying everything they had once protected. Contemporary sources describe how Mongol commanders would deliberately assign these conscripted troops to operations against their own cultural groups. Former Chinese soldiers would be sent to attack Chinese cities, captured Russians would assault Russian territories, and Persian warriors would be forced to devastate Persian lands. The Mongols had weaponized cultural betrayal, creating situations where survival required the destruction of one's own identity. Beyond physical destruction, the Mongols had perfected techniques for erasing civilizations so completely that they would be forgotten by history itself. Archaeological evidence and surviving chronicles reveal a systematic approach to cultural obliteration that went far beyond simple conquest. The Mongols understood that destroying a people's connection to their past was more devastating than destroying their present. In conquered territories, they would systematically target libraries, archives, and centers of learning with a precision that suggests careful planning rather than random vandalism. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, containing centuries of accumulated human knowledge, wasn't accidentally destroyed during the siege. It was deliberately targeted as a strategic objective. According to the chronicler Ibn al-Fuwati, Mongol specialists would interrogate captured scholars to identify all repositories of written knowledge within their territories. These weren't interrogations for military intelligence, but systematic surveys designed to map and eliminate cultural memory. Books weren't simply burned, they were destroyed according to specific protocols that ensured no copies would survive. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate loss of knowledge. The Mongols would force captured scribes to personally destroy their own works, making scholars complicit in the erasure of their life's achievements. Master calligraphers would be compelled to burn books they had spent years creating. Historians would watch as chronicles they had carefully researched were dissolved in specially prepared acids that ensured complete destruction. Language itself became a weapon in Mongol hands. In territories they intended to permanently occupy, Mongol administrators would systematically replace local languages with Mongolian or Chinese. Children would be forbidden to speak their native tongues, and adults caught using traditional languages would face severe punishment. Within a generation, entire linguistic traditions would simply disappear. The Mongols had discovered that language carries more than communication. It carries thought patterns, cultural concepts, and ways of understanding the world that cannot be directly translated. By eliminating languages, they eliminated entire ways of thinking about existence, society, and identity. This wasn't just conquest, it was cognitive colonization. Religious practices faced similar systematic elimination. But rather than simply banning traditional beliefs, the Mongols would corrupt them through forced syncretism. Local deities would be incorporated into Mongol spiritual hierarchies as subordinate figures. Traditional ceremonies would be modified to include Mongol elements until the original practices became unrecognizable. Contemporary accounts describe how Mongol cultural specialists trained administrators whose sole function was civilization destruction, would study conquered societies to identify the specific elements that gave them cohesion. Family structures, social hierarchies, economic systems, and spiritual beliefs would all be analyzed for weak points that could be exploited to create systemic collapse. The efficiency was terrifying. Persian sources document how entire cultures could be dismantled within decades, leaving populations that retained human biological continuity but had lost all connection to their ancestral ways of life. These weren't refugees or displaced persons, they were cultural orphans, human beings whose civilizational identity had been surgically removed. The most chilling aspect of Mongol systematic cruelty was not its scale, but its bureaucratic precision. Archaeological discoveries in the ruins of Samarkand have revealed administrative documents that detail what can only be described as industrial-scale human processing operations, complete with quotas, efficiency measurements, and quality control procedures for different types of executions. According to surviving Mongol administrative records translated from medieval Chinese archives, conquered territories were subject to what they called the Great Sorting, a census operation that catalogued every human being not by name or family, but by their utility to the Mongol war machine. Each person received a designation: immediate execution, skilled labor, breeding stock, psychological warfare asset, or administrative tool. The Persian chronicler Juvaini described witnessing sorting operations where Mongol clerks would process thousands of captives per day with the mechanical efficiency of grain merchants. Families would be separated based on predetermined criteria, with children assigned to Mongol families for cultural reprogramming, women distributed according to breeding quotas, and men allocated to construction projects or military service based on physical capabilities assessed through degrading examinations. But the most psychologically devastating aspect was the Mongol practice of forced selection. Captured family members would be compelled to choose which relatives would live and which would die, with the understanding that refusing to choose meant everyone would be executed. Parents would be forced to select which of their children would survive, spouses would choose between each other, and siblings would decide their family's fate under Mongol supervision. Contemporary Islamic sources describe how these selection processes were designed not just to reduce populations efficiently, but to create psychological trauma that would render survivors incapable of effective resistance. Those who lived carried not only grief, but guilt that would paralyze them psychologically for the remainder of their lives. The Mongols understood that survivors who had participated in their family's destruction could never fully trust themselves or others again. These broken individuals would return to their communities as walking testimonies to Mongol power, their very presence a reminder that resistance was futile and collaboration was the only path to survival. Mongol records indicate that they maintained detailed statistics on the psychological effectiveness of different selection scenarios. They had discovered that certain combinations of forced choices created more lasting trauma than others, and they refined their techniques based on empirical observation of survivor behavior patterns. The systematic nature extended to execution methods, which were selected not for efficiency but for psychological impact on witnesses. The secret history of the Mongols references specialized execution specialists who had developed techniques designed to maximize suffering duration while ensuring that victims remained conscious and vocal for as long as possible. These weren't acts of passion or battlefield fury. They were professional operations carried out by trained specialists who approached human suffering as a technical discipline. Mongol armies included officers whose sole responsibility was optimizing terror production, individuals who studied pain the way other military specialists studied logistics or fortification. The most disturbing aspect of Mongol civilization was not its capacity for cruelty, but the sophisticated legal and moral framework that justified and regulated that cruelty. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal code, reveals a society that had developed elaborate ethical systems around practices that other cultures could only comprehend as pure evil. Within Mongol territory, the Yasa provided extensive protections for Mongol citizens, merchants, and diplomatic envoys. Religious tolerance was mandated, theft was severely punished, and social mobility was based on merit rather than birth. Mongol women enjoyed property rights and legal protections that were centuries ahead of their time. The same legal system that guaranteed justice for Mongols had created detailed protocols for the systematic dehumanization of everyone else. According to Chinese administrative documents, Mongol law distinguished between different categories of human beings with the precision of a biological taxonomy. Mongols were people, urgent, subject to the full protection of law and custom. Conquered populations were livestock, mal, possessing utility but no inherent rights. This wasn't metaphorical language, it was precise legal terminology that determined how different groups could be treated under Mongol jurisprudence. The paradox was profound. The same Mongol commanders who would spend days planning the complete extermination of a Persian city would meticulously follow protocols to ensure that Mongol prisoners of war received proper treatment according to the laws of civilized warfare. They had created a moral universe where identical actions were either virtuous or evil, depending solely on the ethnic identity of the participants. Mongol religious policy revealed similar contradictions. The Mongols were genuinely tolerant of different faiths within their empire, protecting Christian churches, Islamic mosques, Buddhist temples, and traditional shamanic practices with equal vigor. But this tolerance extended only to populations that had submitted completely to Mongol authority. Resistance, even non-violent religious resistance, justified the complete elimination of entire religious communities. Persian sources document Mongol commanders who would spend mornings consulting with Buddhist monks about spiritual matters, afternoons organizing the systematic torture of captured Islamic scholars, and evenings participating in Christian religious ceremonies with equal apparent sincerity. They had developed a compartmentalized morality that allowed them to be genuinely devout while simultaneously organizing industrial-scale atrocities. The legal framework extended to family relationships within Mongol society. Mongol law provided extensive protections for family integrity, severe punishments for adultery, and elaborate inheritance rights that protected widows and orphans. These same legal protections explicitly excluded non-Mongol populations, creating a system where family destruction was simultaneously a protected right for Mongols and a legal obligation when applied to conquered peoples. Contemporary accounts describe Mongol administrators who would enforce elaborate protocols to protect the dignity and welfare of Mongol civilians, while simultaneously implementing equally elaborate protocols for the systematic degradation of non-Mongol populations. They had created parallel legal systems that operated according to identical principles, but produced completely opposite results based solely on ethnic classification. The most chilling aspect was the genuine belief among Mongol administrators that they were implementing a just and moral system. Surviving Mongol correspondence reveals officials who saw themselves as righteous servants of a divinely ordained order, bringing civilization to chaotic lands through the systematic application of superior laws and customs. The true horror of Genghis Khan's empire was not that it produced unprecedented levels of human suffering, but that it proved how easily sophisticated moral systems could be constructed to justify and organize that suffering. The Mongols had created something far more dangerous than simple barbarism. They had created industrialized inhumanity, operating within a framework of law, order, and religious devotion. Modern demographic studies suggest that Mongol conquests may have reduced global population by as much as 11%, making them proportionally more devastating than both world wars combined. But the statistical impact tells only part of the story. The Mongols had pioneered techniques of psychological warfare and cultural destruction that would influence military thinking for centuries, creating methodologies of terror that would be refined and applied by subsequent empires throughout history. The administrative documents that survived reveal the most disturbing truth of all. The Mongol system worked precisely as designed. Territories that experienced complete Mongol processing rarely produced effective resistance movements. Populations that survived the systematic destruction of their cultural identities became remarkably compliant administrative subjects, easier to govern than regions that had been conquered through conventional military means. Genghis Khan's true innovation was not military tactics or political organization. It was the discovery that human societies could be psychologically engineered through the systematic application of trauma. He had learned that breaking the human spirit was more effective than breaking human bodies, and that populations that had witnessed the complete destruction of their moral universe would accept any alternative rather than face that chaos again. The genetic legacy alone tells a staggering story. Modern DNA analysis suggests that approximately 16 million men alive today carry genetic markers indicating descent from Genghis Khan's lineage. This represents not just conquest, but a biological transformation of human populations through systematic reproductive violence on a scale that defies comprehension. But perhaps the most chilling legacy is institutional. The Mongol discovery that terror could be bureaucratized, that cruelty could be systematized, and that moral frameworks could be constructed to justify any level of human suffering provided a template that would echo through subsequent centuries. Every genocide, every systematic persecution, every industrial-scale atrocity that followed would bear the fingerprints of innovations first perfected on the steppes of Mongolia. The man who died as Genghis Khan in 1227 had achieved something unprecedented in human history. He had proven that civilization and systematic inhumanity were not opposites, but could be synthesis into something far more powerful and dangerous than either could achieve alone. He had created the world's first bureaucratic horror, a machine for producing suffering that operated with all the efficiency and moral certainty of any other governmental institution. In the end, the most disturbing secret hidden from history was not what Genghis Khan did, but what he proved was possible. He had demonstrated that human beings could construct elaborate ethical systems to justify unlimited cruelty, that sophisticated legal frameworks could be built around systematic dehumanization, and that entire civilizations could be made complicit in their own destruction through careful psychological manipulation. The steppes had birthed something far more terrible than a conqueror. They had produced the first architect of systematic inhumanity, a designer of suffering whose innovations would outlive his empire by centuries, and whose techniques would be refined and applied by every subsequent system that sought to reduce human beings to administrative problems, requiring final solutions.